Welcome back to the learning channel Excel in Excel. So it's great to have you again, and today we'll discuss some advanced database functions in Excel. So these are basically aggregation functions. That means they can sum, they can count, they can take a standard deviation, they can find out the average of a data which is stored in a database. So if one does not know the database functions in Excel, one can still survive. It's not that it's a do or die. However, once you know the database functions, it becomes much easier to handle very complex scenarios. So for example, if we have a filter condition based on if this is equal to greater than this, if this is greater than this is less than this is equal to this. So we have multiple conditions based on which we want to extract the data. The database function makes it simple. So without much ado, let's see what the database functions are. To understand the database functions in Excel, I have taken the help of a database which I have taken from kaggle.com. The reference is given here. So this is the data of Uber drives. So it records the time when an Uber vehicle is taken, to the time a Uber vehicle was held, how many kilometers, or sorry, in this case, how many miles was traveled, and what was the purpose of the travel, and the start place and the end place are recorded. By the way, when we talk of database in Excel, what we mean is an organization of data. So if we see, this is a well organized data, right? In this well organized data, we have first column as the start date, next column as the end date, next column as the category, and then we have the start place, stop place, miles, and purpose. So when we talk of a database, the data must be arranged in the rows and columns. Of course, that's true for any spreadsheet or most of the spreadsheets. But the first row of the database must have the names of the columns, or rather the names of the field. So we have a field called start date, we have a field called end date, we have a field called category, we have a field called start place, we have a field called stop place, we have a field called miles, and we have a field called purpose. So while it is not necessary that there should be data in every cell, in other words, I might have a possibility that I did not know the category of this particular travel, and therefore I might have left blank. So the blanks are allowed, but the idea is the data is organized in the rows and columns, with the first row giving the names of the columns or name of the field. And therefore, each of these are considered as a record. So the first record says that the travel was taken on 1st January 2016, and of course it ended on the same day. It started at 9:11 p.m. and it ended at 9:17 p.m. It was from the same place to the same place, and the kilometer traveled in that round trip was 5.1 kilometer, and the purpose was meal or entertainment. So as we can see that this is the first record, then we have the second record, then we have the third record, and so on and so forth. So when we use the database functions in Excel, the function works on this entire database, and it works record by record. So there's the first record, there's a second record, there's a third record, and so on. Now, thus, what is the prerequisite for using database functions? We must have a database. And here in front is a sample of the database that we have. Next, of course, what are the database functions that we can have? The database functions that we can have, the major ones are DAVERAGE, DCount, DCountA, DGET, DMax, DMean, DStandard deviation, DStandard deviation of a population, DSUM. Now there are few others. As you would notice that, for example, we possibly know what an average function is, we possibly know what a count function is, we know what a count A is, what is max, what is mean, we know what a sum function is. So these are basically functions that we already possibly know, much simpler functions, but with a D in front. This D stands for a database. So if we look at this data set now, the same database that I talked about some time back, and we ask ourselves this question: what is the average miles traveled for meetings? In that case, now we need to extract records from this database, right? This database is here. We need to extract records from this database which satisfies this condition that the traveling must be for meetings. So what we'll first do is we'll identify the records where the purpose had been meeting. So if we look at this first 13 rows of this database, actually 12 rows, first row is the name of the columns, the name of the fields. Now, since we are looking at the meetings, where do we expect the meetings to come? In the purpose column, in the purpose field. Now, therefore, this is one record which satisfies the condition that the travel was for the meeting. So let's take this out. So this will be one record which will be of interest to us. Next, these three records also satisfy the travel which was for the meeting, and therefore one by one we'll take these three also for our consideration. We continue looking into the database and we see, okay, two more records satisfy the condition that the purpose of the travel has been for the meeting, and therefore we extract this also. So when we use the database function, the first thing that is required is, depending on the condition, whatever the condition we are talking about, based on the condition, the records are identified. And after that, whatever the function we want to apply, that means whether we want to sum or we want to average. In this case, of course, we are talking of average because we are talking of average miles. So the fact that we want to average, we will do that on these selected records. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these 6 records has been extracted from the larger database based on certain criteria, and the criteria was that the purpose of travel must be for meeting. And once we identify the records, then of course we apply the database function onto whatever is our intention. Our intention is of course to figure out what is the average of the miles, and therefore the database function will be applied on this column, the miles column, for these 6 shortlisted records. Now that's how the database function works. So I repeat, whenever we give a condition, the database function first identifies the records which satisfies those conditions, and once those records are identified, then the database function works on the field, for example in this case miles, to figure out what the answer would be. So a typical database function looks like a DFN. Why am I calling a DFN? It can be DSUM, DCount, DCountA, DMax, DMean, DGET. So D is there and there is a function, and the syntax that it requires, it first requires a database, and then it requires a field, and then it requires a criteria. So continuing with our same example now, since we have identified the records already, so we are looking at a D function, that of course would be average, so the function would be DAVERAGE. Now first we need to look what is our database. So we first need to fill up the database, and this is going to be our database. Okay, it's a snapshot, the actual data is bigger than this, but whatever is on the screen, this is our database. In other words, A1 to G13 is our database, and since we know already how to give range names, we could have also used a range name here, but for the time being, this is the database that I assign to the D function. Next comes the field. Now these are all the fields that we have, and out of which I am interested in the miles. Why? Because what is the average miles? This is our question. So we are interested in the miles, and therefore miles is going to be our field name. Do note the double quotes in the miles. That means the miles is put as a string. And then of course, what is our criteria, right? The criteria should be that purpose should be equal to meeting, right? So the criteria we can put purpose equal to meeting, but this is where we have made a mistake. The criteria is never written like this. So whenever we are using a database function, or in short as I am calling them as D function, whenever we are using the D function, the criteria can never be written as a condition like this. Rather, this is wrong. The criteria must be in the form of a range. Okay, the criteria must be in the form of a range. So here I have added a range. What is the name of the field on which the criteria, in which I am looking for the values? So the field name is purpose. So here I have the purpose, and purpose should be what? is a meeting. Therefore, the criteria that we are talking about here must be a range of at least one column and two rows. This is important. The criteria must always be a range, and the minimum size of that range is one column and two rows. So in this case, we are saying purpose and meeting. So the first cell of the criteria, it need not be the row 1, it can be anywhere, but the first cell of the criteria must be the name of the field. And then onwards, we can have what is the value of the field that it should match. One important thing to note is, if there is any spelling mistake here, the answer will be wrong. So what I prefer to do it, when I write the criteria, I prefer not to type in PU or POSC, but I just prefer to copy and paste it, so that there are no chance of making a mistake. So in this case, therefore, our criteria is J1 to J2. This is the criteria, and therefore my actual function will look like this: DAVERAGE A1 G13 A1 to G13 miles J1 to J2. Right? So what we can do is, we can work this out in Excel and see whether we are getting the correct result. So now we are in Excel, and as we said, we are going to as we had seen in the presentation a little earlier, we will use the first 13 rows only. Of course, we could have used the entire data set, which is the large one, but to keep the symmetry between the presentation and the workout, we will go by the same range. So naturally, I first need to put the criteria. So as I said, I'll copy it and maybe paste it somewhere here. And what is the value for this purpose? Again, I'll copy maybe from here and paste it somewhere here. That way, what I have ensured is that I don't have any complications later about spelling or whatever. Now, what I am trying to find out? I am trying to find out what is the average miles for meeting. Therefore, what now we are going to do is, we are going to write a database function. Let me make it bold. So we are going to write a database function, and as we had seen, the function will be DAVERAGE. So first it asks for the database. So let's select this database. That's the range we said. So here we have our database. Then we require the field, and the field in this case, because we are trying to find out what is the average miles, and miles is a field here, so we will give miles here. And lastly, we have the criteria, so we will put the criteria like this. And here we are ready with our first database function, which calculates the average mile travel for meeting, and there we are. So now we know that the average mile traveled was 6.533 miles. So again the formula. So before we write a D formula, we first need to actually get our criteria ready, and once our criteria is ready, this is what we get. So DAVERAGE, then we give the name of the database. It can be a range, or A1 to G3, so it's an address of a range, or it can be a range name 2, and then we give what is the field that which we are working on, and finally what is the criteria. And as I said, criteria must be a range. So what happens is, if you look at this formula looks pretty English, that this average function will work on the field name miles, subject to the record satisfying the condition that the purpose is meeting. Now that's exactly how the database functions work. So we have just seen how this formula gave the result. So as I had mentioned, the average function will work on the miles, subject to the condition that the purpose was meeting. What happens if we make our question a little more involved now. So we are saying, what is the average mile traveled for meetings or for customer visits? So what is the average miles traveled for meetings or for customer visits? Now, since we are going to use a database function, again, we'll have to identify the purpose, which can be meetings or which can be the customer visits. So we again identify the records. So this is one record that satisfies this condition. So let's extract that out. Then again, we have this record which satisfies the condition for customer visit. So let's extract that out. We again have these three records which satisfies this condition based on the purpose being meeting. We have next record also which satisfies the condition, the purpose being the customer visit. And again we have the last two records here which satisfies the condition because the purpose is meeting. So this time we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 records satisfying the condition, either the purpose being for meeting or the purpose is for the customer visit. Now therefore, what we would have is we are going to look at this particular column, again like before, the miles. So we are going to look at this miles column and average it out for those records which would have satisfies this condition. And therefore, what would happen now? Now our criteria would look like this. So just notice here, what we have done is we have added one more row and we had put customer visit there. Now when you write our criteria like this, it basically means that the field purpose should have the value meeting, or the field purpose should have the value customer visit. That means if we have this OR condition, okay, if there is an OR condition, we write our possible values in separate rows. So this time our criteria becomes a range of one column and 3 rows, that is J1 to J3, and therefore our formula would look like D average A1 to G13, that's the range that we had taken before, miles remains as it is, and J1 to J3, right? Again, we can work this out in Excel and see the result for ourselves. So back to the worksheet, we would have to just do a few modifications now to get our result. So as we said, now the purpose was meeting or customer visit. So let's copy the customer visit here, and this becomes our extended range now. So this is our criteria range, and therefore if we look at our formula before, all we need to do is we just need to extend our criteria from I9 to I11. That means just to include the customer visit too, and therefore what we have 14.925. So this is the average miles traveled if we also consider the customer visit. Maybe it is just worth noting that here for a customer visit we really have higher miles, and therefore we have got a little higher value this time. Considering the same case as before, exactly same, let's say we make a small mistake while selecting our criteria, and let's say instead of the 3 rows we end up selecting 4 rows. In other words, we make the criteria as J1 to J4. This is interesting. It might be an inadvertent mistake, but what is the result? The result means basically that the purpose can be meeting, or the purpose can be customer visit, or the purpose can be anything. A blank row basically means that it can be any value, and therefore what would happen? Right, you must have guessed it correctly, that now what we will get is we will get all the miles averaged out, because we said the purpose can be meeting, or the purpose can be customer visit, or the purpose can be anything. That means all the records in the data set will satisfy at least the last criteria, that the purpose can be anything, and therefore you will therefore get, in this case, the average miles traveled in the entire data set. In other words, the fact that we had given meeting and that the fact that we had given customer visit become immaterial in the face of a blank cell. So a blank cell basically means that we can take anything, and if we consider our range from A1 to G13, we will get an average of all these ones. So therefore, when we give a criteria, we need to be careful that we haven't inadvertently added any blank row unless until there is some reason for giving that. So in this particular case, the result would be what is the average miles traveled, and that the fact that we had also added for meetings or for customer visit will go for a toss. It is only what is the total average miles traveled in the database. Let's take another question now. What happens if we have, instead of an or, an and condition? So what you are saying, what is the average mile traveled for meetings and that the start place was carry? So there are two conditions now like before, but the joining condition is an and. In other words, the travel must be for a meeting and the start place must be carry. Now therefore, we have two fields to look at: purpose, meeting; start place, carry. And therefore again, like before, what happens is we identify the records which satisfies this criteria. And in this case, we see that there are only two records which satisfies this criteria. Start place is carry and purpose is meeting. Whatever the values in the other fields, we are not bothered about. The start place should be carry and the end place should be meeting, and therefore we have these two records. How do we write our criteria now? We write our criteria like this. So this is our criteria. So therefore, when we are having an and, what we do is we put all the field names in the first row, in different columns of course, but in the first row of the criteria range, and then we put the value. So when we put this, what it basically means that purpose should be equal to meeting and that the start place should be equal to carry. So our criteria range therefore becomes, in this case, J1 to K2, and our formula would look like this. So let's work it out and see what happens. So in the worksheet, now what we will do is we will modify our criteria, and now what we will do is we will also add the start place here, and as we said, what we are looking at is carry. Again, what I am doing is I am avoiding any typing. What I am trying to do is I am basically trying to copy paste. It's not that you can't type, you can really type that out, but if there is any error, maybe an extra space even, or any different characters somewhere coming in, the results would be varied. For example, in this case, let's do this. So in this case, of course, this becomes our criteria. So purpose is meeting and start place is carry, and therefore what we will have to do is, in this formula now, all we need to do is again revise our criteria, and this time our criteria will be 2 columns and 2 rows, and this is the result. So now, as we said, these were the 2 records which matched it. So one is just 0.8 and the other one is 8.3. So as you can see, the average would be 4.55. Now what I was saying was, if by any chance, if I had put a space here, let's say after purpose I had put a space, now you see it gives me an error because it could not find the proper value. So that's the reason what I am saying, that we should be very, very careful about the spellings, etc. However, as you will notice that if I really typed it in, and if I typed in a different case, say as long as my spelling is correct, the answer will be there. In other words, this is not really case sensitive. So we can write them in small case, uppercase, mixed case, doesn't matter, as long as the characters are exactly same as it appears in the database. Again, for example, if I give meetings, because there is no meetings, again I'll get an error. So let's get another question now. this time what we are saying is that the average mile travels should be for meeting, or that the stop place was Fort Pierce. So now what we are doing is we are looking at either the purpose is meeting or the stop place is Fort Pierce. So these are the two fields now that we are putting our magnifying glasses onto. Therefore, again like before, we will need to figure out what are the records which satisfies the condition. So purpose, in this case, if you look at the first record, the second record or the third record, none of the purpose are meeting. However, they are all stopping at Fort Pierce, and therefore these records get selected. The fourth record satisfies both the condition and therefore gets selected. So the first three get selected because they satisfies the condition related to the stop place. The fourth record gets selected because it satisfies both the condition, stop place as well as purpose. Again, this record, if you see, these three records here, they satisfy by the virtue being the purpose being meeting, and again the last two, they satisfy because the purpose is meeting. So what we are saying is that, in other words, that the purpose should be meeting and stop place can be anything. That's condition number one. Condition number two is the stop place needs to be Fort Pierce and purpose can be anything. And therefore, it's no wonder that this becomes our criteria. So what we have done in this case, this criteria is now 3 rows and 2 columns. And what it reads like is this, that the purpose is meeting and start place can be anything. That is, purpose is meeting and start place is anything. Or, because when we go from one row to another, it becomes an or condition, or purpose can be anything and the start place must be Fort Pierce. So I repeat again, when we write in the same row, they are an and condition. Therefore, purpose is meeting and start place is anything. When we move from one row to another, it becomes an or condition, and therefore, or purpose is anything and start place is Fort Pierce. So as you can see, if we have a complex condition, writing a criteria like this is much simpler rather than trying to write with an if, else if and such thing. So this becomes very easy to understand. It's easy to debug. In case we have made any mistake, it becomes an easier thing to debug. So in this case, our criteria becomes J1 to K3 and our formula would look like this. So let's work it out. So back to our worksheet, we will change our requirement. So this time it is not start place. What we are looking is at a stop place. So again, I will copy and paste. That's the thing that I prefer. So purpose can be meeting and the stop place can be anything, or the purpose can be meeting and the stop place needs to be Fort Pierce. So let's copy it and paste it here, and therefore this becomes our so this becomes our new criteria, and therefore in this formula all I need to do is I need to change our criteria range to this. So as you can see, very smartly we had put a little more complex condition this time, that it can be purpose can be either meeting or the stop place can be Fort Pierce. So when you have a mix of and or, we can intelligently use the rows and columns within the criteria range, right? Let's continue with another question. And what is it this time? What is the total mile traveled when the start date was between 11th of January and till 14th of January? Now, for saving of the spaces, what I did was I gave you a short snapshot. So when we work it out in the worksheet, we'll take a bigger part of the database. Now, in this case, what we're looking at start date. Now, you see, both the conditions are based on start date. So, the start date should be greater than equal to 11 January and the start date should be less than equal to 14 January. So, what we'll do is, we'll write our criteria like this now. So, notice here, we are using start date in both the place. So, we are saying start date should be greater than equal to 11 January 2016, and because time is also considered here, I am also putting in the time, and that the start date should be less than 14 January 2016 up to 11:59 p.m. Now interestingly, what would happen is, because we have also the time value here along with the date, we also have the time. If we had just given 14 January 2016, 14 January 2016 starts at just after 11:59 p.m. of January 13. Now that is the point when it starts. So if we avoided the time, it would have taken the start date as less than equal to 14 January 2016 00 am. In other words, it would have given the result only up to 13th January, because just when the 13th January ends, 14th January starts, and that starting time would have been considered if the time was not specifically mentioned. If the data set did not have the time, of course we didn't have this problem. But now this is the condition that we are having, and therefore our criteria is N1 to O2, or in other words, if we are finding what is the total miles. So this time of course we are doing a DSUM, because we are finding the total miles, not an average this time, but a total. So we are going for a DSUM, and of course the remaining part remains same, except that I have used the entire database this time. Let's again go to the worksheet and check it out. So let's get going in the worksheet. So as we had seen, our criteria is now based on start date. So I copy the start date to ICA, and it was from 11 January. So let me copy a date of 11 January. That way my typing would be less. And let me put a date of 14 January. So I copy and paste here. Let's make the columns bigger. Now, as we had seen, what we are saying is that it should be greater than equal to, and it should be all 00. That means starting at 00. So that's what it becomes. Let's make it a little bigger. Right. So we have the start date as greater than equal to 11/01/2016, and time is 00 am. That means when the day starts. And here the start date should also be less than equal to, sorry, let's just edit it here. Yeah, so let's do the editing. Less than equal to, and this time we are basically saying 11:59 p.m. So that's our criteria this time, and therefore what is the total miles traveled? Of course, total miles traveled given this criteria. So this time, since we are doing a total, we will do a DSUM, and let's take the entire database this time. In this type of cases, I actually prefer to use a range name, because it becomes easy. So that's our database. Let's go up. So here we are. So that's our database. Again, since we are still talking about summing the miles, so miles is the field that we are interested in, and of course this is the criteria. And therefore, what is the total miles traveled between these many days? It is 87.6. 87.6 miles. If you so wish, you can actually select this. That is from the 11 January and up to 14 January. And if you check it on in your Excel, you will see at the bottom, in the status bar of Excel at bottom, it will tell you in the status below, it will show you that the sum is 87.6. So you can also cross check it if you so wish. Let's continue with another question this time. And what is the question this time? What is the total mile traveled when the start date was in January? So now we are not working on a specific day or a specific time, but we are looking at that the start date must be in January. Of course, this time I have only the data of 2016. So in this case, if you had understood the previous criteria, it's no wonder that our criteria can be written like this, that the start date must be greater than equal to 1st January 2016 00 am, and the start date must be less than equal to 31 January 2016 11:59 pm, right? So the range still remains N1 and O2. We have just changed some very small things, and this should give us the total miles of January if we use the function DSUM. So quickly let's work it out. So since we already had the criteria, all we need to do is, instead of 11, let's make it 0, 1, and instead of 14, let's make it 31st. And with that, we have the answer, that is 512.9 miles traveled in January. However, if we had, for example, the dates of 2017, 2018 also, in that case possibly we'll have to go on writing further criteria. For example, if my data contained both 2016 and 2017 data, and I wanted that we would have the total miles traveled in January of both the years, then possibly my criteria would look something like this. My criteria might look something like this, because then what we are saying is that the start date must be within 1st January 2016 to 31st January 2016, or the start date must be between 1st January 2017 and 31st January 2017. So again, just to repeat, the start date must be greater than equal to 1st January 2016, and the start date must be less than 31st January 2016, or the start date must be greater than equal to 1st January 2017 and less than 31st January 2017. This would have worked. However, if I had the data of, let's say, 10 years, following this sort of a thing, we would have to write 10 rows of criteria, which is cumbersome. Sometime it might also happen that I don't even know how many years are there, and I need to ensure that all the January miles are computed for. In that case, what do I do? Are there ways in which you can do it better? Thankfully, the answer is yes. So what we can do therefore is that we can now take the help of some of the functions that we have learned before. So let's say we write a formula as start date equal to month of A2 equal to 1. Now why month of A2? Let's see why we are giving A2. Let's understand that first. Now A2 happens to be the first record. Okay, A2 of course happens to be the first start date of the first record. Now in this case, please note that we don't need to give a range. We don't need to give A2 to A1000 or something like that, because we are already mentioning the database. Whenever we are writing the DSUM function or any D function for that matter, we are giving the database. So Excel already knows in what is the range in which this formula needs to be evaluated. And therefore, the evaluation starts from the first record, second record, third record, fourth record, like this. So if I can give the condition or the criteria only for the first record, it will automatically go to the second record, third record, fourth record and give you the correct answer. So even if I write month of A2 equal to 1, or actually this is how I should write. So when I write month of A2 equal to 1, when the D function evaluates, it will first look at the first record and therefore it will look at A2. Then it will go to the second record. Then it will automatically become A3, A4. We don't have to bother about that. Now, therefore, what I am writing the criteria as start date, and in the first row, in the second row of my criteria, I am writing equal to month of A2 equal to 1. Now, in this case, A2 is the date of January, and therefore that's equal to 1, and therefore it will be true. So when we type this in our worksheet, we will only see it as the result. We will not see the formula until and unless we make the formula visible. We would see the result. And therefore, if we now write our formula like this, DSUM A1 to G1156, that is the total data set, miles N1 to N2, unfortunately, we will not get the result. Possibly we will get the result as 0. Now, why so? Right? Why so? It is because what it does, because we had said start date is true, so it goes into this start date and it checks for whether the value is true or a false. Now start date does not have any value which is either true or false, right? Start date column has actual date and time. It does not have true or false. Since none of the records satisfies the condition that the start date contains the value true, therefore the result will be 0, and therefore this sort of criteria is not going to work for us. So what do we do? Okay, this brings us to the concept of computed criteria. Now what does computed criteria means? Computed criteria basically means that I am giving a criteria which is not based on the values that you see on the database, but based on certain condition which applies to certain of the values given on the dataset. Now therefore, what was the formula here? The formula here was month of A2 equal to 1. Now when we make a computed criteria, just assume that a new column is created. I haven't given any name. Now therefore, what Excel looks at is that, mind you, I told you in the beginning that the minimum size of a criteria range is 1 column 2 cells. Now therefore, here also it is 1 column 2 cells, but the first cell is blank. Now therefore, what it does, when Excel evaluates, Excel sees, okay, does this name appear in the database in the field? It doesn't. And therefore it understands that we are considering a computed criteria. And when we are talking of a computed criteria, assume this, that Excel creates a new field. Okay, Excel creates a new field, and in this it calculates whether month of A2 equal to 1. And in this case, month of A2 will be equal to 1, and therefore there will be a true here. Similarly, it will continue with all other records and it will compute if the month of A2 equal to 1, A2, A3, A4 like that. If it is January, for all the January days, you will get a true in this imaginary column, and for all non-January days, we will get a false in this imaginary column, and therefore with this we will get the result. So this is how we handle computed criteria. But sometime, to make it more English, to make it more understandable, it's okay to give a name to the computed criteria as long as this name does not appear as an existing field name. Okay, so what I have given the name? I give month January. So month January will be either true or false. That's the imaginary column as I have talked about. But this month January is not a field name in the given database. So whenever Excel encounters a field name which is not there in the selected database, it understands that we are using a computed criteria. So let's work this out and see what happens. So we start on a clean slate, and this time we are going to make our criteria, and by our logic what we said was equal to month of A2, right? Month of A2 equal to 1 for January. If it was a February, you could have written true. So this is the formula, and as I said, we would have the range like this. As I said, a minimum size of a range is 1 column but 2 rows. So the first row is blank. That means it's a computed criteria, and therefore what we can write now is DSUM. Again, let's select the database. As I mentioned before also, I prefer to have a range name in this case, but once we have selected this, let's go back to our formula. So that's our range, and again we are finding the total miles. So therefore our field name will be miles, on which the sum would work. So sum will work on the miles column, and what is our criteria? Our criteria is this. And therefore, you see we get the same result, 512.9, which you had got the last time. Now, to make it more English, to understand what we are doing, as we said, we can put a field name like month January. And there we are. So, in a computed field, what's important is, whenever you are doing a computed criteria, what's important is that this field name must not be any of the field name which is given in the database, and because in the formula Excel already knows what the database is. So just before we end, just one more thing to emphasize, that in this condition here I had written month of A2 equal to 1. Why A2 equal to 1? Because A2, this is the first record, this is the second record, this is the third record. So, and in our database, the first record is this, and the field which I am now evaluating, that is the start date field, which is in, so the first value of the start date field is in A2, and therefore we are saying that the month of A2 should be equal to 1. Will it automatically become A3, A4, etc.? Yes, it will. And why? Because here is our database. So therefore it will start with A2, then it will go to A3, then it will go to A4, it will go to A5 till it goes to A1156. So it will evaluate every record and it will identify those records on which the DSUM would be used. A1 does not affect here because remember the definition of database, the first row of the database must contain the name of the column. So in any database function, it expects the first row to contain the name of the column, and therefore that's never a part of the computation. But if you give a database and you don't have the names of the columns in the first row, the database functions will not work. Okay. This is the way in which we can actually come up with computed criteria, and computed criteria can give you a lot of power. We can have and, for example, one condition and another condition and another condition. So as long as your conditions when applied to a record results in a true, that particular record will be selected for whatever the D function we are talking about. So this video was about the advanced feature of Excel, where we saw the database functions. Why do we use a database function? When we use a database function, the criteria for selecting records becomes easier to comprehend, easier to write, and easier to understand. So it's the criteria is a separate range, and we have the rows and columns where we write down the criteria. So any trained eye can look at that range and immediately understand what are the conditions that you had applied for selecting the records. And of course, once we see what is the function, like it can be an average, it can be a sum, it can be a count or count A, count for numbers, count A for non-numbers as well as numbers. So the selection of the record is based on the criteria, and the function, for example DSUM, works on the particular field that we had mentioned, in this case miles. Of all the database function, one function is a little different, which is DGET. What DGET does is it identifies or it picks up a record which satisfies the given criteria. So dcount, dcount A, dsum, daverage, dstandard deviation, all of them work on multiple records which are selected based on the criteria. However, DGET looks for a single record which satisfies the criteria, and it will actually get that record for you, right? For example, if we are giving a DGET miles, then it will figure out what is the value of miles for that record which satisfies the criteria. Now, one caveat here: if there are multiple records which satisfies the criteria, then DGET will give you an error. So DGET is used only when whatever you are looking for is unique. That means only an unique record gets selected based on that criteria. Only in that case DGET will extract that particular value of the field which you had mentioned. In our case, it might have been miles. So otherwise, if there is more than one record satisfying the criteria, DGET would become useless because it will give an error. Of course, it can also be useful in the sense that you want to see if there is more than one record satisfying the criteria, and the fact that you get an error itself is an indicator that there are more than one record satisfying that criteria. So thank you for your time once again, and keep excelling in Excel till we meet again.